dunes migrate. I mean, kind of like on the road coming in. You have wind coming from a certain direction, dune comes up the back end of the dune and down the front. And over time, that leads to these dunes slowly moving around. And so every tiny little layer you can see in these rocks is evidence of another dune that swept by here. And so it's not like we're just looking at, oh, there was one dune. This is evidence of hundreds, thousands of dunes that came through this exact spot.
Wow.
About 80 million years ago or so.
So I guess when I was a wee
You're talking about how this was all deposited during the Jurassic era, and you think about the word Jurassic and dinosaur. And here's evidence of a dinosaur. Cool. So just in that muddy layer, kind of a little mud bog or an oasis, animals stepped right there, had a big old dinosaur. And we were talking about how just a little bit more firmness and compression can make something survive a lot longer. That's kind of what you get here. The dinosaur presses down on that mud and it compresses it just a little bit more than the rock around it. So everything else erodes out and it takes, geologically speaking, just a little bit longer to break through that bottom layer. Out here is pinyon juniper woodland forest. But junipers are really well adapted to the area out here, even more so than pinyon pines. Pinyons really only moved into the area the last 1,000 years or so when conditions were right, but junipers have been here a lot longer. And a lot of these junipers you see look half dead, almost looks like they're dying off. Yeah. But actually it's intentional. These plants can self-prune. And so during times of drought, times where they're really struggling, they can cut off resources to a certain part of the tree, essentially killing it, so that the rest of the tree is able to survive.
Huh.
Cool.
Even more cool, huh?
Where there is a water source, where it's maybe less rocky, you're going to have more animals grazing. When they trample all the soil crust out here, even though cactus is not invasive, it's one of the first things that really good construction on the opposite side too, going up the east side of the canyon.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I see it. Yeah, yeah. Wow. Sometimes you got to give human beings points.
This is the Canyonlands layer. Much harder capped layer. So you get that nice porous Navajo sandstone and then that ledgy hard layer. And you'll notice it's barely visible upstream, but downstream it shoots upwards to the point where it's a couple hundred feet above the wash, just over there. And that's all part of what we call an anticline, which is this big fold in the Earth's surface. And there's this layer below our feet, all the way down to the Colorado River, called the Paradox Formation. And it's from an inland sea, mostly salt. And so you'd think about climate change, natural climatic change, where you'd reach a glacial maximum, everything would dry out, these inland seas would dry up and deposit a bunch of salt. And then it would global warming, it would start doing the opposite, inland sea moves in, and just back and forth over millions of years create this thick deposition of salt. But it's a good, couple thousand feet below us. And salt, when it's under that much pressure, those unbelievable, millions and millions of tons, it starts to flow or move kind of like toothpaste in a tube or like molasses. And it'll do all sorts of different things. But one thing it'll do is, as it gets squeezed down by the rock, it'll try to push upwards. And so that's what's happened here, where the salt has pushed upwards and created this giant fold in the Earth's surface. And that's the exact reason why this road exists, and they tried 40-mile-an-hour gusts over the next few days.
Yeah. So the way the dunes are today might not be that way tomorrow.
Probably not. Anasazi they used to call them. And so that's the past couple thousand years essentially. But these are a lot more ancient.
Wow.
And as we keep hitting some of these sites, I'll talk more about techniques for dating. There's a lot of debate over the dating and what kind of dates we're getting, how accurate they are. But these are at least a good 2,000 years, at least the age of Christ. And at oldest, there's some evidence to suggest that some figures could be as old as 8,000 or 9,000 years.
Wow.
So possibly almost twice as old as the pyramids.
When I was reading about
Billy goat again.
so what were elk? What
Something like that. But yeah, absolutely.
this was an artist studio.
Right.
It's great on the wall. Right on this inside wall. Yeah, you see them all right on the wall.
Oh yeah, fantastic. That's for pigment. There's no doubt. You can't keep food on a vertical hole.
Just to keep the material kind
Take a
of
look,
stable
John.
as you're grinding. They become active, and part of their life cycle for getting nutrients, they pull minerals out of the rock and then place them on the outside in this sort of film. But it takes a very long time to do, and they've tried different tactics of trying to use the width of canyon varnish to determine age of pictographs or petroglyphs, and it's a pretty...
We haven't seen much of this on this type of wet.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really lush riparian area. And you can see all the debris from recent storms. This whole cut bank here is actually... These are 50s that someone had a camp right there and left a bunch of cans, and there was like a old refrigerator rack. There was all sorts of random shoes, all sorts of random stuff there.
Some stuff when you drive through the West, you think it's so old, and it could just be from the 40s.
Right.
And it looks really old.
Outrun the pothole or the water source drive. And there are entire ecosystems in some of these potholes. If you're exploring a lot of areas in the maze or the needles or out in the sky, and you'll often see big slick rock sections with all these dried up potholes, and sometimes there'll be water in them. But there are entire ecosystems in this that go dormant when the pothole dries up. And so when water gets into some of these potholes, you have all these shrimp that come out of their little hiding holes. You get all these little bugs and microorganisms and everything else. And their entire life cycle is in the span of that pothole's existence. So they live, they produce eggs, it dries up, and they all die, sometimes in the span of days.
And they can do it.
Yeah. And because conditions are so harsh out here, you see that with a lot of the ecosystems. A lot of the mosses out here, the biological soil crust is the same, where it's mostly dormant most of the time, but you put a little bit of water on top of that, and then it all greens up and it starts its life processes again.
Perspectives.
So when were men around? Again, how many?
I want to say there were some isolated populations on certain continents that survived a lot longer than you think in the past 20,000 years. But I think in North America, at the end of the Ice Age, 10,000 years ago, was about before.
So do you guys come and check this out to see when, I mean, do people watch this when it's full of water?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, it's actually really interesting in the winter. Sometimes this is all almost like a big glacier. It's all ice. And there have been times, a couple years ago, it was kind of like this, but when things were particularly wet, in the early 80s, I heard a story from a ranger who used to work down here, that she hit the bottom of the canyon and ice skated all the way to the Great Gallery back.
Wow.
But that is, you know, as recently as February when I was here, it was mostly like this big ice sheet extending along a lot of the canyon.
I would not expect that, but it does get close here.
Yeah.
That's a lot of water.
Yeah, it really does, and that's one thing that I saw in the 5 years ago, in the heat of the summer, you can't imagine it being cold out here, and then in the middle of the winter, you can't imagine it being hot.
What do the waves get out here?
In the middle of winter, we can get down to the teens or single digits as a low. That means that all of our years from now, it doesn't change that it's negative, but you get pretty cold. And that's big saguaro cacti and things like that. throughout human civilization over the last 10 to 20,000 years, we've had a very, very cool, stable climate. Actually unusually cool and stable when you look throughout a lot of periods of the Earth geologically. So there's reason to believe that if we didn't have such a stable, what's called natural climatic cycle, you were leaving the last ice age, and if you look at the system of how that can get described in the atmosphere, it's supposed to be during a cooling period. So I heard that
That's a lot of poop. That's a lot of poop. Lot.
That's brutal.
Looks like forest. Of global warming. Because not only are we making the Earth hotter, but we're also negating the cooling period that's supposed to be happening.
It's a double.
Right, so we're experiencing the heating even during the period we're supposed to be cooling down.
So we named it after the giant cat was down and all it did.
Watch it come across this. See that? The wind moving the sand.
Just gotta put off your arm.
Yeah, I'm gonna tell Claire.
Yeah, that's security. Really nice desert park.
These are pretty high.
Tall walls.
It's soothing, isn't it?
I'm trying not to get sand in my eyes.
The sand counted as fiber would be good. I'm doing all my talking now, guys.
With tiny humans at the bottom. For scale.
His mom always wanted us to pose in a picture. We're like, you don't, it's so beautiful. What do you need the people for? And she's like, scale.
Yeah.
You don't know how big it is.
Yeah.
Are you a canoer?
Part-time.
Yeah.
I don't have that.
Or you are big, isn't it? Or I've only seen it in Mississippi. We have friends who have canoed the whole thing. That's a thing. You know, something like the Columbia, the headwaters of that, you're like, it's nothing. They come out of like the ground, practically.
Oh yeah, up Cafe Galleria.
This is amazing, John. This canyon as a whole is freaking amazing, isn't it? Look. Yeah. of stone cap. Sounds hollow. Stomp a little bit.
Yes, yeah. And you can see some of the pictographs over there. Yeah, very active day. See some of the pictographs over there, but even though this is the most deteriorated site as far as the pictograph quality, we have a lot in the way of cowboy stuff here. And so here's an example of some of the cowboy. Keep it on the picnic table. I don't care if you do that.
No.
And so over here, you see an inscription by Joe Middlecombe. And so that was that rancher I was mentioning that came out here about 1909. Apparently his favorite phrase was "goddamn sons of bitches."
Who was my mother?
A platform that you could rest your hand on, and then two straps to loop your fingers into. So this was the handle of an atlatl. And an archaeologist, Polly Shaftsman, in the mid-70s first saw that, and that's what made her start thinking, hey, this might be a lot older than we think.
So the, no, never mind. No, yep.
You can actually see that flood last year. You'll notice there's a little cut bank here, and then there's that second sandier cut bank below. That cut bank is completely new. All of that sand was deposited last year. And it used to be just that flood bank on the right side that went straight down to the wash. But, you know, floods can carve stuff out, but they can also deposit the flood banks.
Yes, on the western side, yeah, right. And then in the far northeast corner, that's the driftlet area. The glaciers never made it through there. That is quite early. Yes, on the western side, yeah, right. And then in the far northeast corner, that's the driftlet area. The glaciers never made it through there. That is quite early. The problem is the raindrops come by and clean it up.
Julie, you can try to date with varnish. There's a couple other ways you can try to date things. Even though the organic material is mostly gone, you can find artifacts and try to correlate them. In the 70s, they excavated a cave in Upper Horseshoe Canyon called Cowboy Cave. And they found these unfired clay dolls that had very similar details as some of the figures on the Great Gallery, which led them to think, oh, maybe
So for it to be that dark, that's ancient exposed.
Yeah.
Varnish.
I'm going straight for the bed.
Water.
Yeah. Sandy Hill. At work. Taking my time in the shade. Sands, rock, precipice of death.